we know that it has been beneficial in the currency of reproductive success for men to have sex with a variety of women. Okay, that's fairly straightforward. But why do women do it? Because we know women also engage in short-term mating. They engage in affair mating. So estimates vary, but say somewhere between, say, 20 and 35, 40% of women have affairs, even if they're in a committed long-term relationship. Interesting issue. Well, what do they get out of it? They don't increase their direct reproductive success and never could have, because unless their partner happened to be infertile, the most they can have is basically one kid a year. And so adding additional sex partners doesn't do anything for their reproductive success. Okay, and so it's been a puzzle, and there have been, maybe 4 or 5 leading hypotheses about why women do it. And this is one area where I've changed my mind on pretty dramatically. So early on, a former student of mine, Marty Hazelton, who's now a professor at UCLA, and other friends and colleagues like Steve Gangestad and Randy Thornhill, put forward this idea that the reason that women do it is that they're pursuing a dual mating strategy. That is, they're trying to get investment from one guy, like the good dads, but good genes from another guy.
Oh, wow.
And so it's
But is there any research done on what type of mate a woman is likely to cheat on?
Well, that's a good question. So there's been some, and it's not conclusive, but basically the only way this could work, and I have to back up just a second on that, we know that affairs are very costly for women. So if discovered, they result in infidelities, result in violence. Sometimes they result in killing. Getting to the killing, I don't know if we want to get into that maybe later in our conversation.
Yeah, you wrote a whole book on murder.
I wrote a whole book on murder. Yeah, the murderer next door. But also, women suffer more than men. If an infidelity is discovered, they suffer reputational damage. They suffer sometimes social ostracism. It's cataclysmic for their relationship. So, it's one of the leading causes of divorce worldwide across cultures. Is if there's a female infidelity. And so the issue is, what benefit could be so great to a woman that she's willing to risk all these costs if it's discovered? And so the good genes dual mating strategy argument could work in principle, and it could work if there were no costs. And this is, one of the reasons why men and women commit infidelities in secret. It's been driven underground. People don't go on Twitter and say, "Hey, I just had an affair on my partner." It's driven underground. People try to keep it under wraps so they don't experience the costs. And of course, there are costs to men as well by being discovered. They're just not as cataclysmic as they are for women. So the only way it would work, though, is if getting back to your original question, is if there's a large discrepancy between the woman's regular partner and her affair partner in terms of the quality of his genes. And so what these good genes dual mating strategy theorists propose is that there are certain markers of good genetic quality. They hypothesized masculine features, and there's a logic behind that. They hypothesized symmetrical features. So we are a bilaterally symmetrical species. So normal development, we have, our hands, our arms, our legs grow, more or less symmetrically. But there are things that cause deviations from symmetry. So mutations, so genetic mutations can cause deviations. Diseases can cause asymmetries, and environmental insults in a variety of ways. And so what the good genes theorists argue is that if the male is very symmetrical, then that's a marker that he's not experienced a history of disease or environmental insults, or a high mutation load, or has a what they call a developmental system that's very kind of impervious to these insults. So even though they've suffered the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, they still maintain that symmetry. Well, I think there are problems with that. But anyway, back to backtrack a second, why I changed my mind. So I used to advocate this. Well, it seems it's logically plausible, but I started to doubt it. And I started to doubt it for two reasons. One is some replications, some larger scale replications of the work started to fail to replicate the original findings. So what they did is, how did they test this? What they looked at is, do women change their preferences when they're ovulating? So because it's only in that narrow window of ovulation that she's going to be getting the good genes. So what they looked at is women's normal mate preferences, and they tracked them over the ovulation cycle, and do they change to prefer more masculine, more symmetrical features when they're ovulating, and then go back to their normal preferences. And the initial studies suggested, yes, they do. Initial studies suggested that when women have affairs, it tends to coincide with when they're ovulating, and some other things like that.